The sunset clauses legislation introduced in November 2015 was designed to prevent unscrupulous developers from benefiting from a rise in the market and project delay by rescinding their contracts. In simple terms, if a purchaser can demonstrate that it would be detrimentally affected by the rescission, there is very little likelihood that a court will permit a developer to rescind the project contract. There are likely to be unintended consequences of these changes. At Gadens, we play in this particular sector, and we're seeing quite a few developers who are concerned that the legislation may work against them in circumstances where it was not really intended that they be affected. I say this because when the court comes to consider an application for a court-sanctioned rescission of the contract, it must take into account ultimately whether the purchaser has been prejudiced, effectively, whether it would be, in the terms of the legislation, unjust or inequitable. We think that every time a purchaser doesn't get the benefit of its contract, it will be unjust and inequitable, and that's the way the court will see it. The result is site sterilisation in circumstances where construction costs have risen and continue to rise, where funders are thinking twice about the viability of the project, and in circumstances where the delay is such that the purchase price for most of the buyers is historically low. The changes result in developers of sterilised sites being faced with a number of unpalatable options. The first is to continue and record a loss on the development. That is highly unrealistic, and in many circumstances a construction or land acquisition funder will not tolerate such a result, and there is the prospect of the two real consequences emerging. One is that the project will be put into administration, or secondly that a third party may come in and buy the site without the burden of the contracts. Both of those last consequences are not consequences that our government would necessarily have contemplated when drafting the legislation. So, while the legislation certainly has achieved its object of dealing with the unscrupulous operators, on the spectrum of developers, there are a significant number of affected developers who will need to navigate this legislation extremely carefully. After having taken legal advice, they're left with very little option but to deal with their buyers one-on-one, explaining the reality of the impact of the legislation on the project and effectively negotiating a result where the project can proceed, but on a negotiated basis.